Before Jesus, John was just a fisherman. But then Jesus showed up, and one invitation changed everything. John walked with him. He was his friend, and he heard Jesus teach. He watched miracles happen with his own eyes. After Jesus ascended, he kept preaching, kept writing, kept pointing people back to Jesus. Thousands of years later, we're still reading the words of a man whose life was completely changed, all because he walked with Jesus.
I want to start somewhere weird today in this series in the book of John. I want to start with this small editorial decision that John made nearly 60 years after he met Jesus, when he sat down to write maybe the most theologically dense gospel that we have. 5 times in this gospel, 5 times, he refuses to use his own name. Instead, he gives himself a title, the same title every time. He calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. Let that sit with you for a minute. Feel that. You see, he has every reason to name himself because he has every reason to lead with his credentials. They're quite amazing. Let me show you. He stood at the cross, the only male disciple who did. He outran Peter to the tomb. If you're competitive, you're like, yes, he did. He beat him. Yes, it's awesome. He saw the transfiguration. He spent 3 years in the inner circle. He's the only one of the 12 that didn't get martyred. Pick any of those. That's awesome stuff. If this was an Instagram profile, he'd have those things in the top, like gives you those little things that happen. Or if this was his Facebook status, he would say, so this happened today, outran Peter, or something like that. He didn't do that. He didn't use any of those things. He didn't put his name to this. He picks this, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And listen carefully, because the order of those words matter. Not the disciple who loved Jesus, the disciple whom Jesus loved. He defines himself of a receiver of this love that he did not earn, that he did not generate. And that's what he wants on the inside cover of his life. Now, that's going to bother us a little bit today. That's going to bother us for the next 3 weeks, honestly. And that's why we're spending 3 weeks on this, because he wasn't always this guy. He wasn't the guy who says, the disciple whom Jesus loved. You see, in the Bible has tons of proof. Before he was the guy that was reclining on the chest of Jesus at the Last Supper, he was a hot-tempered fisherman with rough hands and a worse temper, who once asked Jesus if he could call down fire and destroy people because they just annoyed him. Think about that. The disciple Jesus loved had a before. And so does every one of us in this room. That's why it matters. You see, we all walk into this room with some kind of identity. Maybe it's your work identity. Maybe it's your relationship identity. Maybe it's an old wound that's your identity. Or maybe it's an addiction that has become your identity. But what John is going to do over the next 3 weeks, he's going to offer us a different one. But to receive that identity, we have to be willing to look at our own first. So today we're going back. We're going way back. We're actually going before the boats. We're going before the call. We're not even starting in the New Testament, because what God did with John wasn't new. He does it over and over and over. You see, it's this amazing pattern. So this guy in the book of Judges, we're going to Judges again, guy in the book of Judges, he's actually hiding in a hole, and the angel of the Lord shows up to him and basically calls him into something. So if you have your Bible, you can turn to Judges chapter 6. We're not going to spend a ton of time here, but we're talking about Gideon. Gideon is one of the judges. He's kind of like the opposite of Samson, if you know what Samson is, if you don't know who Gideon is. But Israel has been in this cycle about 200 years of just being beat up, basically. They keep making bad decisions, and when we jump into this story, they're being steamrolled by the Midianites. These are raiders, and basically there's this young man, and his name is Gideon, and we find Gideon threshing wheat inside a wine press. Now, if you know anything about threshing wheat, which I'm going to make an assumption that you just don't, this is not a good spot to do it. To thresh wheat, you need wind, and he's basically in a hole. He's in a pit. So for you, understand it like this. It would be like you going to grill steaks on Mother's Day or Memorial Day, and instead of doing it so your neighbors can smell it, you know that smell, like they know what I'm doing right now smell? Not that one. You're going to go and you're going to do it in your bathtub. Yeah, kind of weird, right? It's kind of hiding. That's where he's at right now. Let's jump into Scripture. The reason he's there, though, is because he's low. Gideon is low. All right, so when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all the wonders that our ancestors told us about? And when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hands of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" This is a great verse, 15. "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." He's basically saying, I think you showed up, but you've got the wrong guy. I don't know if you've seen everybody else, but I'm not the guy. I looked in the mirror today, I'm still not the guy. The Lord answered, he said, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Kind of a crazy story. Like I said, he was in the lowest part, hiding, doing the job that he was doing. And then he basically argues with the Lord, saying, "It's not me. There's no evidence that that's even me." Now, God doesn't really correct him as much as he just changes the time frame. He says, "Go in this might of yours." And he's asking, what might? It's the might that's coming. You see, God is using future data, not the present data. And so many times he does that with us. We're thinking present. He's thinking calling and future. The point isn't at all Gideon's potential. The point is Gideon's caller. Remember that. You see, what makes him a mighty warrior isn't that it's his arm, it's the voice that named him. So God names you by what you'll be, not who you are right now. And he does that before you've earned the title. Now we're going to leave the book of Judges. We're going to jump forward over 1,000 years. We're going to end up at the Sea of Galilee. Now there's two brothers fishing in their boat with their dad, mending nets, doing what they do, what their dad did, probably what their granddad did, probably what their great-grandfather did, and probably what they'd assumed they would die doing. And this is where we find John. Now, before we go into any theology, we have to look at this kid that Jesus walked up to in the morning, because most of us have this idea of John that he's either praying, or he's in this stained glass version, or he's in this painting and he's laying his head on Jesus. But we're not going to go there, because that's not the kid in the boat. It's a totally different kid. That's the person that he became later, after years and years and decades of formation later. But we have to start who he was this morning, or none of this really makes sense. So here's what we actually know. We know that John had working class roots. He grew up in a family fishing business. He wasn't poor, but he wasn't elite. He would be like blue collar, hands-on, ordinary life. He was part of a crew. He was not alone. He worked alongside his brother, James, and he had partners, most likely Peter and Andrew. Unpolished. He had an accent because of where he was from. So that means that he was looked down by the religious elite. He had no credentials, no training, no formal training. Acts actually calls him unlettered and ordinary. He was strong, but a little misdirected. Let's go back. Can we just burn them all? That's still a lot. He had a quick temper. He had a nickname as one of the sons of thunder. So we have to think that he was competitive, he was a little bit tribal, and he was ambitious all at the same time. Take that person, this is who Jesus called. Not the finished version, he called the starting version. So we have to ask the question, why him? Because if we look at that list, yeah, okay, but really one of Jesus' guys that wrote books in the New Testament? Why pick that kid? I think the first one's pretty visible because you could, if you look at him, you can see that he had some qualities. He was present. He was at the dock in the morning. He wasn't somewhere else playing video games or whatever else they were doing. He was teachable. When Jesus said, "Follow me," he didn't negotiate, he just left. He had capacity. Capacity matters. He worked all night as a fisherman. He hauled in wet nets in the cold. You don't do that without some grit. And then he had fierce loyalty as well. The loyalty was so misdirected, again, that he wanted to call down fire on people. But in all of this, we can see that the wiring was there. It just needed Jesus to redirect it. And I'm going to say it, it's cringy. He needed to be rewired, right? That's what he needed to be. Because if you look at him, he had things on paper that look good. But the second thing that we're going to look at is what really matters. Jesus didn't run an interview with him. We don't see that. We don't read that. He didn't compare John to other guys that were on the dock. Sure, the hunger and the presence and the teachability, they were all where that call landed, but they weren't the reason that it came. The reason that it came was this. It was that Jesus chose him. That's it. Jesus chose him. And that pattern that we just talked about on the beach, that we saw with Gideon, is exactly what the Apostle Paul is going to put words to in this letter he writes to about 30 years later after this call in the book of Corinthians. So we're going to look about that because this church is very confused about why God is calling the people that he's calling. The people are confused. So Paul writes to Corinthians around 50 AD. It's a Roman city, and it's obsessed with status and reputation. Think they want to be known, they want to be seen. This city didn't have deep roots, so everyone is trying to prove their worth. They say, "Hey, look at me, I'm pretty good. I'm better than that person. I've got a lot of credentials." Wealth was big, intellect was big as well. Now remember, when Paul writes, he's usually giving an exhortation or a correction. Now he opens this letter up like this. He said, "Hey guys, you have brought the world systems into church. That can't be. You've brought the mindset of the world into church." Sounds like this. He says, "Brothers, consider your calling. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He chose the weak things to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are. Consider your calling." He's not saying, look at who got picked. He's saying, don't look at how impressive you guys are. You're not that impressive. He's saying, look at the raw material that God started with. If we go up to the verse, he goes, "Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many of you are of noble birth." We even go into, he says he chose the foolish things of this world. The word foolish is like Maria in Greek, okay? You know what it means? Moron. Chose the morons. He chose you. Put that on your screen and say, "He chose me." This wasn't a backup plan. So often we think that it was a backup plan. When we look at John as Exhibit A, this was not a backup plan. And this is what Paul's saying. He's saying we're just naming what God has been doing all along. So often we think that we have the best version of us and that's what God picks. Well, grace doesn't pick the best version of you. Grace picks you and then the version comes later. That hot-tempered kid who wanted to call down fire is the same kid who wrote John 1 about love that drives out fear. Same kid, different finish. But grace had to call him at the start, not after he was finished. Scripture goes on, it says, "Boast in the Lord." This is where Paul lands this section. It's not religious, just talking. He's saying that your origin story, and I love a good origin story, is no longer your resume. Your origin story is grace. So often we think we did the right things, we did this and we did that. He's saying basically you just accepted grace. So boast in the Lord because of what he did. So you can stop curating your resume. You can stop apologizing for your past. You can stop pretending that it was more impressive than it was. The whole point is they picked an unimpressive person. And that's the testimony. And that's the testimony with John, too. John wasn't impressive. But here's the thing that ought to wreck us when we look at this story of John. Every time we hear it, Jesus didn't walk along the Sea of Galilee looking for talent. That wasn't what he did. He walked along the sea already loving 4 guys he was going to call. And the call wasn't a tryout. The call was an announcement of his love for them. Now, if we look at the cross, we can't have this conversation without the cross. You see, Jesus dies for people he's already chosen. Not the cleaned up version of us, including this hot-tempered fisherman that we're talking about who wouldn't understand this for more than 30 years later. You see, this is love that picks first and asks why never. Never. And the resurrection means that our calling is durable. It survives John's worst moments, and he had some pretty bad moments. But because the one who called him already paid for who he was on his worst day. And that applies to you too. So John, 60 years later, who sits down to read the gospel, he refuses to use his own name still. He calls himself the one thing, the disciple whom Jesus loved, not the disciple who pulled himself together. That's not what he says. That's not what he calls himself. Can I encourage you to not use those words for yourself either? Not the disciple who earned the title, the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's the name that fit because that's the name that started it. And the cross is what made that name true. And hear this, that exact name is an offer for you this morning, if you choose it. Now, John didn't get his name alone. He got it standing next to his brother and his best friends. So whatever Jesus is doing in you tomorrow, he's doing in a we. Think of it that way. So the person next to you, the person sitting next to you right now, is not an accident. They're the person whom Jesus loved too. So if we go back to John, he is not the disciple who loved Jesus. Yes, he did. He's the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that direction of the love is the gospel. So what do you do with this? You learned about John today. You learned about some Gideon. I want to challenge you. I want to challenge you to go home and write down your before. To actually write down your before. It doesn't have to be, a dramatic version. It doesn't have to be the perfect testimony version. But can you write down the honest version of yourself? The person who you were before you started taking Jesus seriously. There's a way that you can take Jesus kind of serious and the kind of where you kind of play a little bit with Jesus. And then there's a way where you're like, I am all in with Jesus. I want to know what you were like before. I want you to write that down. Write it in your paper, write it on your app, whatever it is. Somewhere private. Don't show this and don't post it. Don't tag me if you post it. I don't want to be any part of that. You're not making a post, you're making a marker. You're drawing a line in the sand. You're looking at this spot like a reference. A faith-building testimony is what you're looking at. Gideon may have said, you know what? I was in this wine press trying to do something. I don't even know what I was doing. I was at my lowest. Your story may be way different than that, but you have a story. sometimes the longer we walk with Jesus, the easier it is to forget where you started. And remembering that is what John did when he said, the disciple whom Jesus loved. He didn't just call who you are, he called who you will be.
Before Jesus, John was just a fisherman. But then Jesus showed up, and one invitation changed everything. John walked with him. He was his friend, and he heard Jesus teach. He watched miracles happen with his own eyes. After Jesus ascended, he kept preaching, kept writing, kept pointing people back to Jesus. Thousands of years later, we're still reading the words of a man whose life was completely changed, all because he walked with Jesus.